This is the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast from Advanta IRA, where we show you how to explore investments beyond Wall Street and open your eyes to new options for your portfolio. It's time to take control and give yourself the freedom to choose where you invest your money.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Today, we are very pleased to welcome on Rich Munroe of BNB Investing Group. And today, we're going to be discussing something that gets a ton of press and good, bad, left and right, but it's short-term rental market, Airbnbs, VRBOs, and navigating what's kind of going on there. Especially if you're an investor, there's a lot of things coming down the pipe with regard to regulatory issues with different locations. Speaking from personal experience down here in St. Pete, it is a lot of red tape and some outright bans on where you can have these things, and understanding, where things are going, how these things work, how to navigate them, how to be compliant, so that way you can take advantage of some of the awesome things that short-term rentals can offer is very key if you're going to be operating in this market space. So Rich, really appreciate you being on with us today. If you wouldn't mind, give us a little background about yourself and kind of how you came to be so involved in short-term rentals.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. Thanks so much for having me. I've been in real estate a little over 20 years and actually started out in using my self-directed IRA to invest in tax liens. That's really how I got my beginnings into real estate. And, I started to learn very quickly, properties in worst case scenario had been vacant for many years, most of the time needing full gut rehabs. And I sold most of those properties off to other investors and let them kind of rehab them. And I was at a much lower cost basis. And then so over the years, as most real estate investors, I wanted to kind of develop a rental portfolio. And I started looking at the long-term rental process. I had properties kind of scattered out throughout Georgia and Savannah, Augusta, and Macon, and kind of started along that track of, getting as much volume as I could with long-term rentals. Very quickly recognized the challenges of having to evict people right before the holidays because they don't pay, and then really just having to basically kind of roll up your sleeves and do another rehab. And I was just looking at the numbers, and it was just, very difficult to kind of make sense of it. Where you're breaking even in most cases because of the dynamics that are involved with long-term rentals. And so it's been about 10 years ago now that I took a close look at the short-term rental model. And for me, it was kind of like a light bulb moment. You've got the same asset, whether it's a 3, 4, 5-bedroom house. And in most markets, you can generate 2 to 3 times the revenue by doing short-term rentals over long-term rental. And so fast forward to today, I've got a diverse portfolio of properties that we own that we've acquired through rehabbing, and then properties that I manage for other investors. I'm mostly in the Georgia, kind of Atlanta metro area, but I'm also down in the Tampa, Florida market as well.
There you go. Awesome. Well, great to have you on today. And I think most people, at least, anecdotally are familiar with just how robust of a market this can be, especially when it looks at, where you're competing, right? If you're in the single family space, you're competing with other single family operators, right? Which can be good and bad. There's some stability in that. But to your point, right, it's you can basically count on a small rehab every time you turn over a tenant, right? And that can be, paint and carpet. That can be drywall and new plumbing. It can be
new appliances,
it can, and new wiring and new copper and everything that goes along with that. So, your risk profile with any investment is going to vary. There is no such thing as risk-free investing. Even just holding cash, you're losing to inflation. But to get back, to the point at hand, is that you can kind of change your competitive landscape with short-term rentals, right? It's a lot easier to tailor something that is going to be attractive to, tenants at a very, or I didn't even use the word tenant, right?
Yeah, we typically call them guests.
Yeah, guest, right? Because you're competing with the, relatively, just ancient system of hotels. And, speaking as someone who travels a lot, the value proposition for short-term rentals is immense. I can't, with basically the only thing I stay in hotels for is business travel, right? I mean, I travel internationally a ton. By just this year, I've stayed in Airbnbs in Finland, the UK, Japan, and at the end of it, I'll be in Sweden, staying in Airbnbs, right?
Very cool.
The value is so much better than these other things, and I don't say that to be anything other than a statement of from my perspective of someone that likes to travel a lot, being able to take real estate and not have to have commercial multifamily, but be able to create significantly higher income streams than you would just from a long-term tenant is awesome. You get to take advantage of that multi-door capacity aspect of larger commercial multifamily and get in at a price point of single family, right? Take that 300,000 and create $1 million cash flow as opposed to having $500,000 to create that $1 million cash flow. But with that said, it's not all just, roses and champagne, right? There's a lot of legislation that comes, especially with the explosion in the short-term rental market. And there's also a lot of operators out there that, can kind of help to bring down the market as a whole. So, past just my love of Airbnbs and good Airbnb operators, from that perspective, what are some big issues that are kind of facing people in the market today, whether they're looking, and let's kind of come from the newly initiated, right? If you're saying, hey, look, I have this rental property, let's turn it into an Airbnb. Like, what are some of the big, like, pump the brakes things that you're seeing, whether it be from, market utilization, legislation, and some things that you really look at for those people?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the very first thing that we, tell folks to make sure that you're looking at, even before you kind of go down that rabbit hole, is, what is the environment for that home in terms of, is it in a HOA neighborhood? Most HOAs and condo associations, if they don't already restrict short-term rentals, there's a risk that they will in the future. There are some exceptions to that, obviously, in some of the vacationary areas that are near beaches, lakes, or mountains. But for the most part, in most of your traditional HOAs, it's going to be an issue and a risk. And I usually tell folks that, there's plenty of properties out there that don't have HOAs as a hindrance, and you're better off kind of using that as your starting point. Beyond that, the very next thing that you want to look at, obviously, like you mentioned, is what is the regulatory environment like, not only for the city that the property is in, but also the county. There's constant changes in a lot of these different local jurisdictions. And unfortunately, the common denominator is there's typically a neighbor that's kind of, taking advantage and kind of a bad Airbnb host and really disrupting the neighborhood, causing issues, causing complaints. And so these local kind of regulators and council members, the first thing they hear or catch wind of is somebody complaining about loud parties and a lot of garbage and things that are affecting the neighborhood. So the knee-jerk reaction typically when in those cases is they want to try to put in place some sort of a ban or restriction on short-term rentals. And there's no mistake that there's a lot of the major cities, even where Airbnb is based, San Francisco, you have to have a primary resident to basically get a legal license. Same thing in Chicago. New York just banned a lot of short-term rentals. Atlanta, of course, is doing the same thing. And so you have to understand, what's going on. And I don't usually use that as a deterrent. I kind of like it when you've got a highly regulated city and county, because you kind of, most cases, operate around the periphery. There are a lot of governments that come up with reasonable regulations. There are several in Georgia and in Florida that just require a licensing requirement, kind of a quick a property inspection when you get started. They just want to check for smoke detectors and kind of exits of the bedrooms and things of that nature. Notify the neighbors what you're doing, who's the contact person as a property manager, and then they kind of put in place a 3 strikes, you're out, right? So if you get 3 complaints, then you can get your license suspended. All very reasonable. So there's a lot of different cities and counties that have that type of a structure. You pay your taxes. They recognize the value that the hospitality and Airbnbs bring to the area for tourism and other reasons. And so, it's basically just understanding what that environment looks like before you kind of plunge in.
Yeah, and the nice thing too is that, especially from the regulatory aspect, anytime you deal with government is kind of follow the money, right? But you kind of have a dichotomy there of hotels which don't like Airbnbs. And I think they're finally figuring out how to work with them. I mean, even some hotels Airbnb their rooms, which I find hilarious when you see
Yeah.
those things. But, especially down here in Florida, there was a lot of money and lobbying from the hotels. There's hotels all over our beach in St. Pete, to get, them to, kind of put in place some of these bans. It's not always just one thing or another, but you have, a good person in your stable of the businesses that still want this tourism, right? If you can get more people in the door, because if they're not going to go stay at the hotel that's 500 a night, they can get a kitchen, 3 bedrooms within the same distance they were going to be for 250 a night. You want those people in your door. You want them coming to your bar, your restaurant, your surf shop. You want them coming. So you do have some, at least I think, push from the local markets to keep this stuff here. So the reason I bring that point up is to just illustrate that, in a highly regulated environment, don't let it just scare you off, right? There's a reason these things come in, but there's also a big need for them, not just from you wanting to have a cheaper vacation with a kitchen and a fridge, but also from a very economical standpoint of the areas that these things are located in. So again, I want people to take away from this just kind of, don't be so scared of it, right? But you have to be willing to accept some things and navigate around some things to be successful in it. It's not like it was in the early days, which I think is good, because we saw a ton of people just coming in and buying up these properties just to Airbnb them. And it
Right.
wasn't good from a perspective of getting a ton of eyes on it in a negative sense. And also, from a consumer standpoint, it didn't have operators that wanted to have good product out there, which makes everyone look bad.
Right.
So, from some of those more regulated markets, right? What are some specific regulations that you've seen come in that have been more problematic than others, and how have you kind of navigated those through your investing and management style?
Yeah, I've mentioned the primary residency requirement, and that's not a mistake that not only in the United States but around the world, the when there's any type of issue with regulations, they typically gravitate to that as the starting point. The whole Airbnb platform got started as a home sharing, rent their couch, rent their bedroom, rent their air mattress out
Hmm.
to folks. And so anytime that there's any rumblings of a ban, that kind of legislation typically gets pushed. So, you have places, for example, like Orlando, that is, in order to legally have a short-term rental in Orlando, you not only have to be a primary resident, but you have to physically be in the home and host it when the guests are there. Now, what's happened as a result of that from an investor's perspective is just south of Orlando in Kissimmee, they've recognized the value to provide that type of housing, especially for that area, right, for Disney and a lot of the other attractions. And so as a result, you've got about 18,000 short-term rental listings in Kissimmee that support that supply, that demand that comes in for the lack of the ability to do it in Orlando. And so there's examples like that. What happened in New York not too long ago with banning something like 15,000 listings. Now you've got an influx of opportunity in the boroughs of Queens and other outlying areas, New Jersey across the river, that are basically spiking and increasing a lot of listings to support that void. So that's typically what ends up happening, and so that like you mentioned, don't really be afraid of it, but just embrace it and understand what the environment looks like, so that you can still navigate in it. One of the other things I'd like to point out before we get too further along is, if you're not that familiar with the Airbnb model and short-term rentals, other than, just using it when you travel, don't forget this is a very, likely path for any property. It doesn't have to be near, different amenities like beaches or lakes or mountains. You can be in any random neighborhood in the suburbs and do very well with revenue compared to a long-term rental. And so the property doesn't have to be in a lot of these destinations, doesn't even have to be walkable to restaurants and bars. It can be a 30, 40-minute drive to get downtown. There's a lot of other use cases for short-term rental guests that include other instances that kind of support that supply of folks that are in those areas.
Yeah, so you brought up 2 points. I'm like, while you were saying that, I'm trying to figure out which question I want to ask you next. We're going to come back to one that we missed. One of like, looking at the properties, not necessarily, close to like what everyone's trying to do, but the other one of actually, we'll do it this way. So, you mentioned some of the kind of the kind of the knee jerk legislative things being the owner occupant stuff like that, or like you said in the city of Orlando proper, having to have like the owner greet you, right? But looking at some of those adjacent markets is really kind of where you're seeing some value now. From that perspective, is that kind of a model that you follow, or do you say, hey, look, let's try to, let the dust settle and come in and be able to operate within some of those tighter regulations, kind of like, Walmart was cheering the Affordable Care Act when it came out because they could be compliant with it and they had advantages to that perspective. Not passing judgment on the ACA at all, but just a case study of case studies. Do you take kind of both approaches, or do you just which way do you kind of operate when you see some of those more restrictive rules come into play?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much of a choice from kind of a long-term investor mindset, right? So you're not going to want to do a lot of investments in an area where, for example, when Atlanta adopted their ordinance, the requirement was that you were a primary resident of Atlanta. You could get a license for that property plus one additional unit. At the time that they passed that 3 years ago, I had 32 properties in Atlanta. I don't live in Atlanta. I live in the suburbs of Atlanta. So I wasn't even able to apply for the license, right? So from an investor's perspective, it's a non-starter, at least from my point of view. So I navigate, long story short, I formed a nonprofit to fight Atlanta. We're currently negotiating with them to redo the ordinance. So we're hopeful that that's going to, they haven't been enforcing the current one. So we're hopeful to get that changed. But I like going deep in areas. I'll cite a couple of examples like Cobb County and Hall County that are in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, where they have already clearly defined the rules. I think DeKalb County has recently done that as well. And it's like I talked about earlier, where it's a very reasonable regulation that everyone can adhere to. I don't want bad apples performing, the small 1% of bad apples that are in our space doing bad things to continue to be able to do so. So the ability to have a structure that identifies the property, notifies the neighbors of who the contact person is if there's any issues, has a complaint process in place, and the ability, if you have 3 occurrences, to be able to suspend that bad actor. I think all of that is very reasonable, and it's in those types of areas that, from an investment strategy standpoint, I'm comfortable kind of doing, kind of going deep in those areas because it's already clearly defined on what the rules are, and they're all very reasonable to adhere to and be able to, perform with maximum potential.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing, especially for Atlanta, I mean, anyone that says they're from Atlanta, it's like, where do you live? It's like your address would be like, okay, Dunwoody or Alpharetta. Like, no one lives in Atlanta. Like,
Right.
whose address is Atlanta? Like, come on, now, that's funny. But I digress. I mean, if you've ever been to Atlanta, you know how much of a sprawl it has.
Yeah.
But from that perspective, though, it's kind of, it brings up a point of saying, when it comes to again, like I think it's pretty easy for people to understand, say, okay, like if there's the real restrictive stuff, like what's the point? Like, you're going to fight the government and win? Maybe, maybe not. But coming into markets that have regulated to a best practice standard, right? Like you'd probably like to see with almost any business. And that's another thing that I think people, from a general perspective maybe miss on the doing short-term rentals is this is much more of a business and all intents and purposes than it is just real estate, right? Like, yes, you're buying real estate, but you're operating a business at the end of the day. I think the people that are successful at it have that business mindset of this is a business, not just a, hey, I have a couple of rental properties that short term. Mindset plays a lot into that. But when it comes to looking at those places, Do you honestly kind of, and I would imagine maybe so, but maybe, let's get into this a little bit. Do you maybe shy away from places that don't have any legislation just because there's the unknown risk of like you experienced in Atlanta where they come down and say, "Hey, now I got 30 properties. Now I got to sell 29 of them," right? Like, do you
Hmm.
prefer now to look at places that have legislation that seems to be in a best practice type structure, or do you still like to try to find places that are, just very unregulated?
Yeah, I mean, I guess again with my investor hat on, it's challenging to get into a spot where you're in the wild wild west, and at any moment you could have the risk of that cropping its head up and having the regulatory environment shut you down and not be able to perform. Let's take a step back for a minute. Like you mentioned, this is you got to run it like a business. It's a hospitality business. To be successful, you've got to make sure that everything in your operation is getting your five-star reviews. So when you get these things set up on a five-bedroom house, right out of the gate, you've got to invest at a minimum to do it right, anywhere from 45 to 50,000 additional dollars to stage and furnish and set up the property. So when you're talking about that type of upfront investment and the energy that it takes to get up and running, you don't necessarily want to be at risk at any moment to be in an environment where you could get shut down or there'd be a risk of not being able to continue to do that model. It's kind of a painful situation to have to shift gears, and then now you have all this furniture that you either have to put in storage or try to sell and convert back to a long-term rental. There are some other strategies that we've looked at historically, like the room by room rental and the midterm rental model as well, that are typically 2, 3, 4 month rentals that are looking for furnished rentals. So there are some other alternatives when the regulatory environment gets challenging. But if I've got investment dollars to put to work, my preference and my starting point is there are a lot of different markets today that in most states that have the rules like I described that are very reasonable for you to be able to kind of invest in strategically.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you see any additional stuff coming or any issues just from like what I see happening is as the regulatory market continues to mature when it comes to the short-term rental space, having more and more stuff that is basically analogous to what we see in hotels, right? Or from any type of commercial real estate dwelling kind of things. But have you seen any type of trends besides just the owner occupancy stuff with maybe things like fire safety, besides just a fire alarm or something like where you have like self-closing doors or fire extinguishers or fire inspections. Picking on fire here for whatever reason, but any other things that you kind of, at least in your mind, think or there's maybe a high likelihood, or again, just I guess the real question is, do you see of anything that hasn't happened yet that you feel is a high likelihood to come in the future that people should be aware of?
Yeah, so I'll cover the first part of that question. There are already some jurisdictions that are requiring things for short-term rentals in addition to getting the license that are things that we should be doing anyway as operators, frankly, but but are put in as mandatory requirements. So, for example, outdoor cameras, noise detection devices. It's already pretty standard for fire extinguishers and smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, yeah, and making sure that the each bedroom is set up so that it has a proper exit in the event that there's a fire. But we are starting to see more and more, as you've mentioned, similar to hotels, where they're going to start to have additional requirements come into play. Uh, there's not really any mandatory requirements for ADA yet, but I'm sure that's something that'll come down the pipe at some point. There are some short-term rental operators that set up their homes ADA compliant for wheelchair accessibility and other things, which kind of gives them an edge. And so I do see some things like that getting added. We may end up having to be like hotels as well. Hopefully not, but the expense to put in a sprinkler system, for example, is possible in some jurisdictions, I would think, at some point as well.
Yeah, and and I tell the story often, one of the bigger shocks I ever got in my career in finance was learning how much it costs to do retrofit for fire suppression. That stuff is wild. Um, sprinkler systems, or if you have the unfortunate case of having to put in fire mineral coated wire for fire suppression systems, you think just Romex is expensive. Look how much that stuff costs. Like, it is nutty.
Mm.
Um, but I think you kind of bring up also a good point is that, anytime that there is regulation, right? And we see this play out in big business. If you can take it from the lens of how to operate within that effectively and compliantly, it will give you a big edge, right? If you can operate smoothly and have your operations done to a point where, again, this is a business that you can, one, be effectively operating within those things, and two, be looking down the road of saying, okay, like you said, with ADA compliance, right? You may be thinking, hey, this business is operating great. We're doing this. But instead of just taking all of your capital and reinvesting it or doing something, maybe hold some back, have a little bit of a war chest for things that you think might be coming down the road. Like ADA compliance could be a lot, or it could be a little, or it could be a lot, right?
Yeah,
Depending
for
on
sure.
what they say. Like if it's just a ramp, okay, great. If it's just easy open doors, not too bad. If it's counter height, ooh,
Or
yeah,
showers with
showers,
bars.
yeah, that's when you're like, that's a kitchen remodel, that's a bathroom renovation. That's when
Right.
it starts to get real expensive. But if you have, kind of accounted for some things and, properly invested, it's going to be a pain. But again, it's something that can, again, just, be something that, is a differentiator too. And especially now in the unregulated side of things, think about the ability to have differentiators from that perspective, right? Like an ADA compliant Airbnb. If you're the only one in the area, that could be a big boon to your business, right? Other
Definitely.
things that can kind of help to generate cash flows are some of those differentiators that people don't think about. A small segment that doesn't apply to, a lot of operators probably, there's kosher Airbnbs, right?
Yeah, you're
Um,
right.
Things that, can really separate and differentiate, having a kosher ADA compliant Airbnb, like if you're the only one, like you're going to have tons of people coming, to use that because you have something no one else does.
Exactly.
So I think that kind of also leads into like, using these regulations to help one, be able to have a short-term rental, which again, anyone in the space wants to have, and two, being able to look at it from a perspective of, how can you make sure that this stuff stays going down the road correctly. Um, so the other question I mentioned that I was kind of two different ways I wanted to ask this question was you mentioned that for the short-term rentals, especially, people oftentimes you think kind of gravitate towards needing to be as adjacent to what the big attraction in the area is. And again, a general rule I would say is like, yeah, if you are, your Airbnb is right next to Amalie Arena in downtown Tampa, yeah, people are going to love it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. What are some things that you kind of, if you guide or coach people or you look at, how far away do you really kind of go from these major anchor attractions or things to still be successful, right? With that.
Yeah, I think there's some other interesting things to kind of keep on that to-do list. There's anywhere there's major hospitals, there's a lot of different data centers that are getting put in, and so there's a twofold when you have a lot of new development in an area. You can take advantage of housing workers to for many years that it takes to build those environments, and then of course thereafter as the growth comes in for employment. And so it's kind of like you can kind of look at your areas strategically, and if you're starting with a clean slate and you're looking at what areas you should be buying in, check all those boxes we talked about earlier on short-term rental compliance, but then start looking at some of those areas that aren't necessarily very close to downtown, but they're close to a lot of these pockets of markets that are starting to expand and starting to build and have a lot of jobs coming in. And for example, I've got several homes on the south side of Atlanta right now that we consistently get contractors in that are coming in to do different types of contractor work for electricians and things like that. And when you've got a 5-bedroom house, the AR departments of these large contracting folks are going through the same math. They're looking at, well, we could put 5 of our workers for 8 weeks in a hotel or an economy stay or what have you, and it's going to cost me, $1,000 a night, or I can get a big 5-bedroom house at $400 a night, and they're comfortable, and it's a third in some cases of the cost of going the other direction. And so we get a lot of consistent 5, 6, 8 week stays in our short-term rental properties from just that one example. And so, there's a lot of all across the United States in different markets. There's a lot of that growth that's occurring that you can kind of piggyback on to, kind of maximize your occupancy levels as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, when you think about what the Airbnb or let's not give free advertisement, the short-term rental market offers to people, right? As opposed to what hotels offer, you have a furnished room, dollar, apples to apples, the same thing. But with the hotel model, people are coming in. It doesn't, it's just the place to stay. It doesn't, there's really no tailoring it to make it more attractive besides just having, okay, this hotel has a spa, this one doesn't. You can really hone in on a target demographic of people specifically with that. I mean, just thinking off the top of my head, and a few examples one that I kind of mentioned to someone that I think they do now, if you have a lot of people that are coming in for data center work, right? Or something that's going to be, setting up stuff with desks in every room, right? Or if you have something where you can pull a Cat 6 cable into every room, so you have people that are coming in working, doing something for that, stuff that doesn't cost you a lot of money. I mean, how much does a cheap desk at IKEA cost? Yeah. Not a whole lot of money to make that really attractive for that profile tenant. A good example.
Same thing with smart TVs, right? Smart TVs are so inexpensive nowadays. So in most of my 4 and 5 bedroom houses, every single bedroom has a TV. There's no reason not to, right? So
yeah. And one example, I'll pat myself on the back, because I think the operator actually took this anecdote that I told him. He's out in Utah, next to Moab. People come from all over the world to go off-roading out there. And he's talking about like, hey, things, like we have bikes and stuff like that, just they go on Marketplace, grab a few bikes, throw it in there. I told him, like, look, you have people that are doing off-roading and stuff, put a small air compressor, Facebook Marketplace, put a small air compressor in every single one. So that way you can say, hey, if you're going off-roading, here you have place for your RV to park on the gravel next to the house. You can fill up your tires here too. Not to say that people need to go out and start spending all this money on stuff, but you can identify your avatar user and you can make it so much more attractive for them to come in with things that are very low cost to you, right? You don't have to go buy nice enough. You're not buying a termite riddled desk off the side of the road, right? But like, again, how much does IKEA cost for having, if you can take your occupancy from, 60% occupancy to 80 over a quarter, it pays for itself and a lot more stuff too.
Absolutely.
Which is something, again, I think that sometimes gets lost a little bit in the noise of Airbnb through short-term rentals. From the perspective,
let me address that. I think it's fine to say Airbnb. There's no mistake why short-term rentals are such a good option for investors, even though it's a little bit more challenging now than it was 5 years ago. But Airbnb does the right thing in terms of, providing this as an option and handling a lot of the simple things that some of the other platforms, frankly, screw up at, right? And so, as an investor that's been doing this for 10 years, and most of the other folks that I know that specialize in this model, no matter what you do, 70 to 80% of your revenue is going to come from Airbnb. Yeah. And there's a reason for that, right? So I there are some things that Airbnb doesn't do quite well, and we could probably do a whole show on that alone. But I do want to give them kudos because they're a big reason as to why this is an option for us as investors.
Well, I mean, for no uncertain terms, they created this market, right? There were short-term rentals beforehand, but you had to go through like a vacation rental agency that was probably located only in that small area. There was no centralized platform to go and be like, hey, I'm going to New Orleans next weekend. I need a place to stay. You could have done it, but it would have been painful, and you just be like, whatever, I'm staying in a hotel, right?
Yeah.
Now it's cool on my phone. Click, click, click. Cool, we got a place to stay. It is half the price, and we got a pool. It's that easy. So I will give credit where credit's due. They definitely created what we know and love as the short-term rental market today, right? For Without them, we wouldn't be having this conversation probably.
Right.
Or we've been talking about something else. So I know we've been connected here at Advanta for a long time. But I think it kind of brings in the next segment that I want to talk about. We talk about regulation because I think it's probably the most apparent, and again, threat, for lack of a better term, to the current modus operandi of what's going on with short-term rentals, right? Government's taking a hard look at this, and that's what's going to be the most immediate kind of change to your profile of what these investments look like. But like we meant, like, we keep hammering on, this is a business, right? What I'd like to get your thoughts on, from an operational standpoint for doing this, where do you see some of the biggest pitfalls, besides just not paying attention to the fact that your Airbnb is illegal in the neighborhood, for operators, coming into this, what are some of the biggest pitfalls that you see people or mistakes you see people making that you're like, it is easy enough to avoid if you just take 2 seconds to either slow down or do something different?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, if you're coming from an environment where you're more accustomed to long-term rental properties, and it's kind of a set it and forget it. You have a property manager. They manage all the stuff with the tenants, and you get your monthly check or ACH payment every month. This is a very different type of dynamic. There's simple things you have to stay on top on from the very beginning. Of course, we typically recommend, you've got to get the internet only service for smart TVs. You don't want to do cable. You want to do pest control, landscaping, garbage service. There's a lot of simple things that you can do proactively. I mean, if you can imagine, the average stay for a short-term rental guest is 3 to 5 days. And the last thing you want to do is have somebody check out and the next one, we missed the garbage for the week. And the next person checking in, there's garbage at the curb just overlaying. And the first thing they see when they drive up to the property is that. So you've got to layer in additional things that can, make sure that those things are taken care of. It requires a little bit more than just relying on the trash pickup service to come pick up. You've got to figure out a strategy to get that bin to the curb on particular days that it gets picked up. And like in the Tampa market, for example, they come twice a week. And so there are, service providers that provide that service, usually for $10 a week or something, very cost effective, that on that very first property, if you're trying to do this at scale, you've got to really put those things in place. Other simple things, a lot of our properties have swimming pools, so you want to make sure that you've got your pool maintenance done on a regular basis and cleaned in between each guest stay, especially if you're doing hot tubs or jacuzzi tubs. And then simple property maintenance things like, we talked about earlier the abuse that properties take with long-term rentals. There is some abuse with short-term rental properties. People are coming in and out of there with luggage, so there will be the occasional, nick on the wall that needs to be touched up. And so those types of things, if you don't pay attention to it over time, your property can start looking pretty distressed and not looking like your listing pictures, which is the last thing you want. So you have to be very proactive with your maintenance team. Every single time that we have a guest check out, we have our cleaning team go through a checklist. Not only to just take an inventory of everything that's in the house to make sure nothing's broken or missing, but also to look around and make sure that we're addressing any maintenance issues. We typically have our handyman go in once a month, changing the AC filter, especially in markets like in Tampa, for example, with the AC getting run constantly. And so you don't want to wait for the filter to be all dirty 2 months later, and you're getting a call at 11 o'clock at night because the AC is not cooling. Right. Yeah. So there's simple things you can do with the property management piece to make sure that you're being proactive. And, we talked about the hospitality piece. The biggest part of this business is the cleaning team. So you want to make sure that you have the right team of folks from the beginning that are experienced with Airbnb cleaning. It's very different than just a regular residential clean. For all intents and purposes, they have to touch every surface in between each guest. And so it's a very intense cleaning, and it does cost a little bit more. Frankly, I'm happy to pay a premium for that. I never try to haggle with our cleaning teams because that's one of the most important parts of the business, right? So,
yeah, and again, think about how you react. You walk into a dirty hotel room, right? It's just have it be clean. Bed made, towels there. It's ready to go because, again, it's a business and it is in direct competition to a hotel,
right.
For what you're offering to people. So I think those are all extremely good points. And I would say also to that effect, kind of what you're mentioning with, having outdoor cameras, right? Again, and there's regulations of needing to disclose that and stuff, but it also kind of, especially for your turnaround, right? You can catch something like your, garbage being left out there. We're like, oh, Matt, need to go over and get that taken care of. And, being able to have some eyes on property, especially in the interim, again, because these properties can be sitting not only for the protection of making sure that, you can see if there's, 30 people filing in for a huge party at your Airbnb, but these properties are, the tenants are transient, right? They're in, they're out. There's going to be times when it's going to be vacant for a few days. And, especially for bad actors, people identify Airbnbs to go in because they know that the owner's not there. These tenants are leaving. There's times where you really need to keep a closer eye on some of these types of, properties. So external cameras, in a compliant fashion and fully, properly disclosed, I think again is a really good thing that people can look at. And how much are cameras, right? Nowadays you can get 4K for pennies on the dollar. It's not a huge expense, right?
Right.
That goes into some of that kind of stuff. The other thing I would imagine is, from the management aspect of, people maybe being a little bit too overbearing with what they have for an Airbnb. Like, what are some things that you recommend people from an operational standpoint? Because the biggest thing you're chasing on Airbnb, and we could do a whole podcast, and I have done on, the marketing, the visibility, making sure that you don't have to zoom in a ton on that Airbnb screen to see your listing pop up, is the 5-star review, right? So, how do you find that people sometimes get a little bit too, you know, overzealous with some things? Be like, there was a small, to your point, like luggage is coming in, it's gonna be hard on your flooring, right? Like, hey, there's a small nick on the flooring over here. I'm gonna, go to war with this person. Like, understanding what battles to pick. Do you have any insight on kind of that, like exactly of like what battles to pick with, operating an Airbnb?
Yeah, no, that's a great topic because you have to kind of put in place a little bit of a balancing act, right? So if you get like one or two stained towels that are damaged that can't be cleaned, you're talking about maybe 15, $20. Is it worth chasing the guest down for that and creating a bad review, or do you just kind of chalk it up to being a cost of operations?
Yeah.
And so I think the rule of thumb that I typically use, if it's an accumulation of multiple things that occur in one guest stay, and all of a sudden you're at a $50, $150, $200 expense, which could happen. You need you get stained on the carpet with wine or on the chairs, and you need upholstery cleaning done. That's a couple $100 event easily to start with. And so you kind of have to pick and choose when you can tell this guest was just not paying attention and there's multiple things that occurred. Now, if it's just one item and it's less than $50 or $40, I may not go after it, right? And so for those of you that aren't that familiar with, again, why Airbnb is good for the insurance that they provide, the way that the process works is if you have an incident that's occurred, let's say it's the stain on the carpet and the chairs, and it's a $250 event to get it cleaned professionally. The first step is you have to reach out to the guest and bring that to their attention. In some cases, albeit very rare, the guest will say, "Oh, sorry about that. Send me a money request and I'll reimburse you for it." And what you're supposed to do is if you get no response or the guest denies it or they decline it, after 48 hours, you can escalate it to Airbnb, and Airbnb's insurance will cover you at 100% reimbursement for anything that the guest causes damage or to the property. And so that's typically the method. So when you have something that's a $15 or $20 event, is it really worth kind of going through that, bringing it to the guest's attention? There are some other ways to get around this where you can get like an insurance damage waiver where you don't have to reach out to the guest. That way it can cover any little small incident. But you're absolutely right. You kind of have to play a little bit of a balancing act of making sure that that it makes sense. Because all it takes is one bad review to kind of drag your listing down. You won't get as many bookings. And if you get a bad enough review below 3 stars, your listing will get suspended for up to 14 days, which means nobody can see it on the platform for 14 days.
Yeah.
So it's a direct impact on your business. And so that's why we talked earlier about the fact that that 5-star review is everything that you do in the business is supposed to be having that as the end game.
Yeah, and especially if you're newer to this space, something that I've seen a few operators do through the past is, remember that this is, not your house, right? Like, yeah, you're furnishing something and you have certain tastes, but at the end of the day, like, do you need to be putting in, $80 towels to the property, right? Like, that damage that occurs, like, for an Airbnb guest, is a perfectly passable, $10, $15 bath towel just fine? Probably. But again, if you're really going for the high end market, yeah, no one to spend the money. But it's you can do yourself some favors with being strategic on where you're spending your money on your property. Again, don't buy the chintziest stuff unless that's just fine for where you're at. But the small stain chair, you know, does it need to be a $300 chair and a $300 fix, or can it be a $50 chair that works just fine, that looks nice, that plays well, right? Think about what you're putting into this for the use case that it's going to be, and especially to your point about flooring. I've stayed in a few Airbnbs where there's one that comes to mind. It was a few years ago where we got notification we were staying there, and they were like, we just had the floors redone, and these things were like tongue and groove hardwood. And this Airbnb listing had been up there forever, and it wasn't in an appreciably crazy nice place. It was fine, but it wasn't like a super high end needs like really good hand laid hardwood floors. I'm thinking, obviously we didn't damage anything, but someone comes back, they go to a wedding, someone's wearing high heels, you're dragging luggage through there. Like, that just seems like a problem that you wouldn't want to have, where if you just had, the manufactured hardwood, luxury vinyl or something, it would have been just fine. No one would have known the difference for that place. So, again, do yourself some favors with, what you're putting into these places for the use. It's, stuff's going to be used harder, right? In general for Airbnbs. Not that people are going to take less good care of anything, but you're going to get more people coming in, sitting down, doing things. You don't eat dinner at your table every single night. Airbnb is probably going to get that chair drug in and out every single guest. So just some things that I've seen with, people who have, conveyed to me or have, expressed things that they've done in the past, I think are helpful to look at when you're operating these kind of businesses.
Totally agree. Absolutely.
So from the perspective of, things that you really like for scaling, right? Because I think that's kind of the next things that people get into, run into a roadblock when it comes to Airbnbs, that maybe they've kind of proved the concept, but, they've maybe accepted some of the issues with the regulatory environment, the operations of things. But when it comes to, again, I think what would probably be kind of the next like stumbling block that people maybe get into is maybe getting a little bit overzealous in how they want to scale. So when it comes to that kind of, second, third, hopefully the 10th step that they take and are successful with, what are some things that maybe you've gone through in that process, or things that you maybe kind of caution people on when it comes to like what parts do they really need to shore up before they kind of take that next step?
Yeah. So I with my very first Airbnb 10 years ago, with intention, I built out a process in order to be scalable. And so I started with that one, and over about 6 months got to 12. And then after a year, 2 years, I got up to 75. And so if you're looking at doing this at scale and you are starting with 1 or 2 properties, everything you put in place should be with scale in mind, right? So I'll give you an example. I mentioned I manage properties in Tampa, Florida as well. I'm based in Atlanta, so I'm a 7-hour drive away. So even if the property is, within a 10-minute drive of your location, if your intent is to kind of be in other markets eventually and do this remotely, there's a lot of things you can delegate to the cleaning team, to the maintenance team, that don't require you to physically, show up at the property every time something goes wrong. And so if you set that up in the beginning and, have that, everyone strategically has that understanding, then it allows you to basically rinse and repeat, add more units. It's a little bit less of a strain when you start growing and adding more listings to your operation. There are a lot of different ways to automate and have a tech stack that does a lot of automation for guest messaging. The AI tools nowadays are just incredible. There's also virtual assistants that you can use to offload a lot of the work. I think at its peak, I was probably spending about 4 hours a week on 75 properties, and so there's a way to delegate a lot of the day-to-day operation that frees you up to basically focus on other things like growing the business and adding more units.
Yeah, and I think you really hit on the thing that we keep coming back to. It is a business. Buying a second rental property, you're dealing with one extra tenant. So you doubled your real estate portfolio, you went from one tenant to two. You do an extra Airbnb, that might be an additional, hopefully it's a ton of them, but like it could go from having to deal with, however many there to doubling it. So maybe you go to dealing with 70 to 140 bookings, right? That's doubling a very large number already. So systems, from the perspective of people that I've seen be the most successful, have been people that understand that you really need systems to scale this stuff, or even just do one or two, right? Systems will save you from a multitude of different things. Now, the issues with regulatory stuff, you're going to have to stay on top of that, personally a lot more than you can. I mean, I'd be hesitant to turn over a kind of like a review of regulatory systems to an AI bot just yet. One hallucination of that AI bot could be real problematic for you if you're basing all your decisions on it. But the you wouldn't think of going into any business and saying, hey, they have really bad systems, this is a great thing to invest in, right? Don't put yourself in that position by not having the systems in place to scale what is a business. It's not just one extra rental property. It is from a very technical point, but you are operating it completely outside the paradigm of the single family real estate model that most people probably have dipped their toes into. Certainly there's people that just went full bore and did short-term rentals as their first foray into real estate. I'm assuming it's probably varying degrees of success in that front, unless they are, a very systems heavy person and they saw the ability to do that. But in general, I would imagine most people coming into this space are probably migrating from the, long-term rental market into the short-term rental market, just by virtue of proximity and experience, correct?
Yeah, that's usually the transition.
Yeah. So, I think we've kind of covered, a good amount of information for people to understand, where we're currently looking at in the market. Are there any other kind of points with regard to either the regulatory stuff or the systems aspects for people that should really be aware of what's going on in the market today that we haven't covered?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a good resource just for folks to be aware of. If you're exploring what market to go invest in and you just want to have a better understanding of the regulatory environment, there's a national organization called Rent Responsibly that provides a lot of resources for advocacy. It also provides details on different nonprofits that advocate for short-term rental investor and owner rights in different areas, right? So I'm the president of a nonprofit that I formed in Atlanta called Amstra, and Rent Responsibly was very instrumental in helping us get started in the beginning. And so they do that across the United States. And so if you're in St. Louis or New Orleans or Kissimmee, Florida, there's probably an association that has got their finger on the pulse of what's going on with the local ordinances. And so even in markets like where Alex is in St. Pete, within St. Pete, there's probably 5 or 6 different rules and regulations with the surrounding Reddington Beach, Indian Beach, Clearwater Beach, that are all very different. And so, Rent Responsibly is a good resource that kind of helps you not start from scratch, that you can kind of get access to different information about what's happening in the regulatory environment as it pertains to short-term rentals.
Yeah, and I think that's real key right there, is getting plugged in with the advocacy groups for what you're doing, whether it's, and they have these kind of groups for any type of, real estate market that you're in, but especially for something that has as much eyes on it right now as the short-term rental space. Again, I think that is, if you take anything away from it, if you're getting into that, get plugged in with that, because that's going to let you network with people. That's going to let you, get the advocacy that you need to help lobby for the changes that, will be most effective for, again, having a an effective regulatory market, right? Because, outright bans and some of the more, problematic ones are going to be there. But if you can have the ability to help shape and change or to help shape the legislation, because changing is maybe a little bit of a tall order, but to shape it while it's coming into play is going to make everything run that much smoother. So again, I think that's a real great point to leave off on. Rich, if people are interested in reaching out to you, learning more about what you have going on in the short-term rental space, what's the best way they can contact you?
Yeah, so I can definitely provide a calendar link, and I'd be happy to have a quick 15-minute strategy call with you to talk about what you're doing strategically with short-term rentals. We can probably put that in the show notes, but I also do a podcast called BNB Investing, and you asked earlier about the technology piece, so I'll do interviews with different service providers to the space, like channel managers, price optimization tools that help automate the business, and we kind of talk about what they provide to short-term rental investors. I also do a lot of interviews with different investors that have different niches within the short-term rental space. We talk about their strategy, how they got started, and kind of what they learned along the way. So things like luxury tree houses or container homes or tiny homes or ADUs, multifamily, so there's a lot of different niches within the space. And so, that's a good way to kind of learn a little bit more about some of the options that are available to you, is check out the podcast as well.
Fantastic. Well, I really recommend that y'all reach out to Rich if you're interested in learning more and connecting with him. He's a wealth of information. So again, really do appreciate your time today, Rich. With that said, this has been another edition of the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. My name is Alex Perny, and we will see you on the next one.
Thank you for tuning in to the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Tune in next week for more investing tips and strategies.
Want to hear more episodes of the Alternative Investing Advantage? Search podcast at advantaira.com and subscribe.